and welcome to Myth Monsters. My name is Erin and I'll be your host for these little snack bite-sized podcasts on folklore and mythic monsters from across the world. These podcasts focus on the actual cryptids, folklore and mythic monsters from global mythology, rather than focusing on the full stories of heroes and their big adventures. I'll also be dropping in some references that they have to recent culture, and where you can see these represented in modern day content, so that you can learn more and get as obsessed as I am about these absolute legends of the mythological world. Well, I finished Baldur's Gate 3 and I honestly feel like a bit of a shell of a person, although I will say I will now be starting my second run and I'm going to be playing as an evil character, so it'll be a whole different game, whole different experience. I'm very excited. I still very much recommend it. But that does mean that you do have me back and paying more attention to all of this, all of the social media that I have been neglecting for the last few weeks because of it, so that is always a bonus. But the most important question this week is, do you feel death? Because this week, we're heading out to the Seven Seas for a nautical legend, and one that is still super prevalent within culture. It's Davy Jones this week. Now, the most important thing to note about Davy Jones from a folklore perspective is that he is not a corporal figure. He is not a squid-faced, crab-clawed Northern Bill Nye character from the Pirates of the Caribbean films, but is considered more a ghost or even sometimes a devil of the seas. With this said, he does have a physical description, which is that he has saucer-like eyes, 3 rows of human teeth, much like a shark would have, horns, and a tail, as well as blue smoke coming out of his nostrils. As I said, he is more of a spirit than of a physical being, and so can freely pass through solid objects and apparently speak, but he cannot speak any recognisable language to people. He is generally considered to be a deity of death at sea, and sailors typically refuse to talk about him. He is often linked to ghost ships as well, and sometimes is noted to be aboard and the captain of the legendary Flying Dutchman ghost ship. However, the two are actually not linked in folklore at all. He generally gets around by just emerging as a spirit on a boat that attracts his attention, and according to legend, he sentences the people or person on the boat to death, and they are immediately transported to the bottom of the ocean to drown. Davy Jones is known to be a malevolent figure, taking these individual sailors and sometimes whole crews to their dooms beneath the waves of the sea, with absolutely no remorse, almost obeying the terrifying call of the sea herself, in her famously tempestuous way. He is known for having an infamous locker. Why a locker? No one is particularly sure. However, this is where any of his victims would be sent to die. Davy Jones's locker is probably the most famous thing about Davy Jones himself. However, this is just referring to the bottom of the sea, or more accurately, a watery grave, rather than a physical locker. We still use this as an idiom to this day of people meeting their end in the sea, and is used to represent the slightly more sinister idea of a sailor's afterlife, and being held in a physically underwater place, like a locker, for all eternity, rather than passing on to a traditional heaven, hell, or afterlife situation. In terms of powers though, because he is noted to be mostly a spirit, he can transport anywhere with ease and is very much untargetable for attacks, and can generally just mist out of situations. He also seems to hold the power to transport people to this locker, and it's thought that he lives under the water, waiting to be called to do his duty of ridding the ocean of people. Now, for etymology, Davy Jones is of course an actual name. Davy is short for David, and Jones is a very common English surname, especially here in the UK. There is some history behind the name too, as there are loads of reasons as to why it might be specifically this name, but none of them are actually confirmed, so I'll go into this shortly. But there are also loads of expressions around Davy Jones, such as to awaken Davy Jones, meaning to cause a storm, to see you to Davy Jones was a threat to kill someone, To be in Davy's grip was to be close to death or very, very scared, and to be sent to Davy Jones's locker was, of course, to die at sea. For history, though, this one is wild. The original story that had him in was written down in 1726 by Daniel Defoe in his book 4 Years' Voyages of Captain George Roberts, and he said the following: "Some of Lowe's company said they would look out some things and give me along with me when I was going away, but Ruffle told them they should not, for he would toss them all into Davy Jones's locker if they did." Now, Daniel Defoe was an English writer, which does explain the very English name of this figure, and is important to note because the English during the 1700s were going around the world on ships as the biggest empire, and because we are an island, our crowning glory has always been in our navy and our ships, and it's how we ended up being the worldwide superpower for such a long time, and I will say through nefarious means a lot of the time. But the English dominated the seas alongside the Spanish, French and Dutch, and so it makes sense that this myth started in the UK and England and was prevalent throughout many European countries, because sailors generally spread rumours and superstitions through word of mouth. Davy Jones came up again formally in writing in 1751 in a book called The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle by Tobias Smollett, with the earliest proper description of him. This same Davy Jones, according to sailors, is the fiend that presides over all the evil spirits of the deep, and is often seen in various shapes, perching among the rigging of the eve of hurricanes, shipwrecks and other disasters to which seafaring life is exposed, warning the devoted wretch of death and woe. However, there are other origin stories that spread only through word of mouth, which do relate back to the name of Davy Jones, as I said I would go back to earlier. One of which was that he was the first assistant to King Neptune, the Roman god of the sea. Another was that there was a pub owner in England called Davy Jones, who threw drunken sailors into his ale locker and sold them into slavery on boats as a punishment. He then went bankrupt, lost the pub, and became a pirate himself, stealing many ships and crews across the Atlantic, where many crew members were actually decapitated and others were locked in the vessel before it sank, with the captain on board as well. Another is that a famously short-sighted sailor, Davy Jones, very often fell off the side of his ship and may have inspired this godly legend. There's even one that Davy Jones was the reincarnation of the biblical prophet Jonah, with Davy Jones meaning Ghost of Jonah, who was punished for his disobedience to God and became the devil of the sea after his crew murdered him, and this was talked about in a dictionary in 1898 with the following: "He's gone to Jones's locker, i.e. he is dead. Jones is a corruption of Jonah the prophet who was thrown into the sea. Locker, in seaman's phrase, means any receptacle for private stores, and Duffy is a ghost or spirit among the West Indians. So the whole phrase is he has gone to the place of safekeeping, where Davy Jonah was sent to." Now, another version of the Jonah story was that he spent a few days in a whale, which, funnily enough, is where the story of Moby Dick comes from. And he said there that his days were very much like in Davy Jones's locker, and meaning that he was trapped there in almost an afterlife-like state. Jonah became, and still is, a very unlucky name for sailors too. I mentioned the Duffy within the West Indian community in that last quote, and according to legend there, the Duppy, as it's known, comes out at night to haunt people on boats. Now, amongst the Welsh, Davy Jones is a very, very common name and refers to their patron saint, St David, who is believed to have saved them from the sea and protects good sailors, whilst bad ones are sent to his locker beneath the waves. Lastly, another dictionary from 1785 defined him as David Jones, the devil, the spirit of the sea, called Necken or Drauga in the North countries such as Norway, Denmark and Sweden. And Davy Jones's locker is David Jones's locker, the sea. I thought it was awesome that the Necken and Draugr were mentioned here. It's a really cool comparison from Norse mythology, and both of these monsters I've already covered in their respective episodes themselves. This is all super interesting history, and it all comes from the mouths of sailors, who had their own cultures and especially superstitions on their own boats, some of them even still being present in modern day boating. There were very strict rules when you were on an 18th century boat, such as no women allowed, black cats being lucky, the birds, albatross and cormorants being good omens, whistling being taboo as it was considered coded messaging, and even bananas being bad luck. Because of these superstitions though, being a sailor was a different culture to being at home, especially within folklore, and Davy Jones was a really big part of this, as were sea monsters, ghost ships and the infamous Kraken. Now a lot of these tales originated from Old Norse and Old English myths, from Viking and Saxon times, and died off on land, but not on the sea. You can still find black cats on board ships and cruises now, as well as stereotypes that have prevailed since then about sailors, such as swearing like a sailor or having lots of tattoos, all of which stem from the 1600 and 1700s boating. In terms of other comparisons, of course we can look at something as mighty as the Kraken, one that has been around for centuries and never been proven to exist, and mostly started within the Vikings whilst doing the same thing as the Brits, conquering other countries whilst navigating harsh and cold seas of Europe. We can consider the Nokken or the Necken, but they are more water spirits that tempt you to drown, very much like sirens, rather than acting as judge, jury and executioner like Davy Jones. I actually think the most relevant figure from folklore to compare him to would be Charon or Harbard from Greek, Roman and Norse mythology. These are the ferrymen for the dead and take them over their respective death rivers into the afterlife. And it makes sense that Davy Jones acts as one of these for specifically water-based occupations and sailors. In real life comparisons, I guess there aren't really any. The only thing left to do is to debunk the ones that we can. Firstly, we need to fully debunk the Pirates of the Caribbean Davy Jones. As I've said, he was never a fully established person and was never noted to have a crew or a ship, let alone them be supernatural sea animals or have control of the Kraken. The Locker was not a separate plane of existence where everything was weird and made of crabs. And whilst Disney did do a fantastic job of these movies, and I really love them, they don't actually represent Davy Jones or his locker in the same way they are presented in folklore. And to debunk the actual folklore too, a lot of this myth is just a name for a metaphor. It's just a way of personifying death at sea. However, because he was named, he ended up becoming this ferryman-like figure for sailors and ended up being the physical representation of the sea taking lives. So even the idea of him being a spirit, demon or deity is really interesting, because it does just stem from the imagination of sailors who put a common name to a really horrible experience. Now, on to modern media. You know, I thought there would be more this week for Davy Jones specifically, but I've included some ghost pirates in here too, just for good measure and to kind of fill out this section a bit more. But for art, have a look at these classic portraits of Davy Jones, such as Davy Jones's Locker by John Tenniel from 1892, and Davy Jones by George Cruikshank from 1832. They are just great personifications of the traditional sailor version of Davy Jones. They are in black and white and they're from books, so really recommend those ones. In movies, we have the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, of course, Dead Man's Chest at World's End, Blackbeard's Ghost, Campfire Tales, The Fog, Kazuku Sentai Gokaiga, Jolly Roger, Massacre at Cutter's Grove, Curse of Pirate Death, and Crossbones. For TV, we have The Monkeys, Popeye, Aesop's Fables, SpongeBob SquarePants, Monster High Haunted, Terry Toons, Willy Whopper, One Piece, Queen Blade's Redemption, Berserk, Supernatural, World of Winx, Defenders of the Earth, Scooby-Doo, The Real Ghostbusters, Camp Lake Bottom, Garfield, Venture Bros, Kim Possible, The Pirates of Darkwater, Danny Phantom, Powerpuff Girls, Hilda, South Park, Growing Up Creepy, Fairly Odd Parents, Codename Kid Next Door, Goober and the Ghost Chasers, The Backyardigans, Castlevania, DuckTales, and Cyberchase. In video games, we have ones such as Dragon Fable, Realm of the Mad God, Nightmares from the Deep 3, Davy Jones, Blood Money, Banjo-Tooie, Fallen London, Alone in the Dark 2, Impossible, Killer Instinct, Doubloon, Chrono Cross, Arcanum, Dota 2, Fable 2, Darkest Dungeon, Five Nights at Freddy's, New World, Dragon Fable, Pokemon, Ratchet & Clank, Thief 2 The Metal Age, Soul Calibur, Monkey Island, Super Mario Bros, League of Legends, Pirates of the Caribbean Online, Lego Pirates of the Caribbean, Divinity Original Sin, Persona 5, Drawn to Life, Medieval, The Path of Exile, World of Warcraft, Uncharted 4, Vegas Strike, Moshi Monsters, Total War Warhammer, and Skyward Sword. My book recommendations this week are from Tales of the Sea, Traditional Stories of Magic and Adventure from Around the World by Maggie Chang, and Breverton's Nautical Curiosities, A Book of the Sea by Terry Breverton, for some nautical-based myths and monsters that aren't always covered in regional mythology and folklore. But now it's time for Do I Think They Existed? Well, it's a tricky one this week because the monster himself is more the depths of the ocean for old-timey sailors, and I guess even modern sailors and passengers alike. I know that if I died in the sea, all gods forbid, that people would say I went to Davy Jones Locker because that would be the coolest way to tell people I have drowned. Anyway, I think this monster does very much exist based on the idea of this. But if we're talking about the spirit who just turns up on your boat and goes, "Lol, time to die," and you're transported to the bottom of the ocean, that's pretty rough, and I'm not sure how much I can get behind and believe this. A fun thing I think of when I think of Davy Jones is, of course, the Disney version. However, my sister and I, when we were younger, we used to put our hands cupping our faces and waggle out our fingers at each other to do an impression of him shouting whenever we used to try and make each other laugh. And it still works to this day, and we are both in our late 20s, and I'm not even slightly ashamed. But what do you think? Did Davy Jones roam the seas, locking people up on the ocean floor? Let me know on Twitter, I would love to know what you think about this one. What an awesome legend though. I'm so glad we got to cover it, and I was super excited to cover him. And honestly, I'm so glad there was so much content around him and the folklore about him. And to be honest, we've never had a chance to go into sailor superstitions and even English Empire and all of those kind of times within the seafaring world. So I'm really glad we got to cover this. It's been really fun. Next week, we are heading over to Norse mythology, and we are looking at a mythical creature who has one of the most important jobs within Norse society. It's running messages up and down the world tree. So get your nuts ready for next Thursday for the infamous Ratatoska. For now though, thank you so much for listening. It's been an absolute pleasure. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give a rating on the service you are listening on. I've got the Twitter for any questions or suggestions on what monsters to cover next, and I'd really love to hear from you. The social media handles for TikTok, YouTube, Instagram and Threads are Myth Monsters Podcast, and the Twitter is Myth Monsters Pod. But all of our content can always be found at mythmonsters.co.uk, and you can find us on Good Pods, Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon if you want to help me fund the podcast too. Come join the fun though, share this with your pals, they might love me as much as you do. But for now, stay spooky, and I'll see you later, babes.